Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all for the opening panel of GNET's first annual conference. Our panel topic is Violent Extremist Pop Culture, Games, Memes, and Slurs. But before we start the panel, we are delighted to have Nicholas Rasmussen, the Executive Director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFCT, and Dr. Shiraz Maher, Executive Director of GNET and Director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, who will each say a few words of welcome to open the conference.
Great, thanks Ashley, and it's great to be on screen with so many of you. It's a genuine pleasure for me to be able to join Shiraz and the GNET team to kick this conference off and to welcome everybody participating wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is wherever you are in the world. I have to say this is a more comfortable Zoom environment than I was on just under 2 weeks ago when I was representing GIFCT at the Christchurch Call to Action Summit Conference. On that conference, I shared a Zoom room with multiple heads of state, but everybody was speaking from carefully prepared scripts, and there was every effort to squeeze every bit of spontaneity out of the conversation, and it really ended up being just a back and forth of prepared statements. So I know today's conference will certainly be much more interactive. And certainly among panelists, and generally provide much more of a genuine learning experience for everybody involved. I obviously will be quite brief, if only because this first panel has such an impressively diverse set of voices that I want to make sure to clear the way for that. Shiraz has heard me say this before, but I think it bears repeating in front of this audience. One of the most important and impactful things I believe we've accomplished over the last year at GIFCT, since we became an independent organization, has been to strengthen and deepen the academic and research component of what we do together as GIFCT and GNET. And that partnership with GNET for GIFCT stands as one of our foundational pillars of our work. And that's particularly true because of the way in which the threat landscape continues to evolve and morph in new and unpredictable ways. And thus the value of what GNET offers will only continue to grow over time. And for those of you who are maybe a bit steeped in GIFCT orthodoxy, you know this already, but again, it bears repeating. Our work at GIFCT is organized around 3 pillars, and those pillars are prevent, respond, and learn. And each of those pillars is aimed at reducing the ability of terrorists and violent extremists to be successful in exploiting the digital domain. After all, that's why we are doing what we're doing. But it's first and foremost the learn pillar that has everybody dialing in and joining this conversation today and through the rest of the day around the world. Shiraz and his team have organized and curated an amazingly diverse and timely set of topics, of perspectives, of voices, and sources of expertise on issues that sit at the very nexus of extremism, terrorism, and technology. That includes voices who are scholars, but also those who are practitioners. It also includes individuals with real world experience working inside tech companies or working alongside those companies trying to achieve a concrete result. And in my experience, again, limited as it is and gained over the last year since I took on this job heading up an independent GIFCT, that's actually the thing that separates GNET and its output from so many other academic output-oriented organizations around the research world. Speed, agility, the ability to
Nick, you've got on mute for some reason.
I didn't touch anything, so that must have been something automatic. I apologize for that. In any case, it's the speed and agility of GNET output that gives decision makers in real time actionable insights that are readily consumable. And I think that certainly distinguishes the output from so many other academic enterprises. And I would argue that GNET's value proposition is reaffirmed each time some new problem or topic or challenge crops up. And then before you know it, there's tangible GNET output out on the street shedding some light on that new problem, whether it's incels, gaming, any of the new variants of extremism taking root around the world. And I would argue we saw this value demonstrated most vividly in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection and violence at the US Capitol. Almost immediately, at least as it seemed to me, the GNET team was connecting with scholars in real time around the world who had some or another unique take on what we were all witnessing on television. And I have to say that even though I'm on of all of your GNET distribution lists, Shiraz, I typically find out about new output and product from GNET when I see it tweeted by some member of your team. And at least from my optic, it's that tweeting process that often serves to inject almost immediately into the bloodstream of our community of terrorism and technology experts and practitioners. That's the thing that seems to get the conversation going and to really accelerate it. And after that first tweet, the paper or the insight quickly becomes fodder for retweeting, quote tweeting, a lot of additional sharing and additional commentary from different perspectives around the world. And all of that adds up to a pretty important multiplier effect as far as I'm concerned. And all of that back and forth adds to our knowledge and wisdom in some powerful ways. Because yes, in the end of the day, GIFCT is membership focused as an organization. We're made up of tech companies. But at the same time, we want the value of GNET Insights to be able to extend far and wide, including way beyond our member companies. So at least from my selfish perspective, I'll sum up by saying that the GNET GIFCT partnership continues to be wildly successful. I know the GNET team has made it a priority for 2021 to include more globally diverse voices in this ongoing conversation about terrorism and violent extremism. And this event shows that you're well on your way to achieving that objective. That objective lines up nicely with our own orientation at GIFCT, our own strategy, where we're determined to become more global in our company membership ranks, but also in the ranks of our stakeholder voices from all of the different sectors. So next year, ideally, when we gather in person for round 2 of this, what I hope is an annual conference, I would assume that we'd be drawing on even more diverse voices, talking about even more diverse and different companies, technologies, and platforms. And that, to me, is exciting and encouraging. So with that comforting vision for a next year, hopefully in person, I will turn back, Shiraz, to you and the GNET team to take things forward. Thanks again for the friendship and partnership that we've built over the last year, and I look forward to carrying it well into the future.
Thank you very much, Nick. And let me also say that this partnership between GNET and GIFCT is a very important one. I want to thank everyone who's logged in, and I won't speak for very long at all. I just want to say a few quick words by way of introduction.
In this I focus on what can.
So I'm getting voice from someone. Yeah, as I say, just to say that GNET is a project led by ICSR, the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, which is an academic research center based within the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And as Nick was saying, when we began to think through what GNET's offering would be and how it would link up with GIFCT, we had to, in a sense, reimagine what a traditional academic project looked like because of that need for a degree of speed, flexibility, and deliverability to be able to respond much more quickly to what are very fast-moving events. And fast-moving events, as Nick was mentioning, Christchurch being one of them, where there is a nexus of not just a horrific terrorist attack, but pressure from government, from other stakeholders who are trying to get a handle on these events quickly. And GNET's ability to do that, as was mentioned after the 6th of January, it was really able to demonstrate how we were able to do that. To that extent, that brings me on to this other point, that this is truly a global consortium. We don't profess in-house at ICSR to have all the answers. We don't profess to know it all, in fact, far from it. What we really pride ourselves on doing with this project is to be able to reach out to this global community of scholars, of practitioners, of think tankers who are working on all these kinds of issues, and to provide a platform in which to showcase your work. So you may have a particular expertise, a particular research project that's unique and niche, working on a topic that you might want to bring to us. And we are keen to showcase that work and to connect you through the GNET platform and through GIFCT's relationships as well with the relevant parts of the tech sector and industry that might not know that you have a solution for that problem, or might not know that you're working on a particular thing that actually is something that they're in-house already thinking about or looking to address. So that's the really important aspect of what GNET is there to do. To that end, we have constructed today's conference over 24 hours that will run to global sort of audiences at both inconvenient and convenient times, in order to make sure everyone has an opportunity not just to participate, but also to listen. So we encourage you very much to please get involved over the course of the day. Do log into other sessions. You can still register for them. So if something takes your fancy, then please do that. All of these events will also be posted online. So again, if there's something happening at an inconvenient time for you, you will have the opportunity to see and hear from it. All that really remains then for me to say is, to that extent, we are keen to hear from you. If you're a PhD student who's sitting there thinking, well, drop us a line, tell us what it is you're working on, what your research is. Even if you're an independent researcher, we're looking to move beyond gatekeeper institutions, or and to really connect with researchers at the individual level, in order to bring you forward and to give you a platform in order to engage with this community. So please do get in touch. And to that end, we will shortly, and within the next few days, certainly within a week of this conference, we will be putting out a call for papers for year 2, and looking to commission some of those in the coming months as well. So again, if you have ideas in relation to that, then we would encourage you to come forwards again and to submit your paper ideas as well. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Ashley, who will be chairing the first panel. But again, thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you both so much for those opening remarks. It was lovely to hear what the plan is and how things have been going. Just very quickly, as we start with the panelist presentations for the attendees, please remember to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A box during the talks, and we'll pose them to the panelists in the discussion period at the end. Our first panelist today is Frenett, and he's one of the founders of Moonshot, has served as a director of the Against Violent Extremism Network, and is currently a co-leader of the Communication and Narratives Working Group of the EU Radicalization Awareness Network, or RAN. Thank you so much, Ross. Take it away.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, yeah, only such an incredible institution with such engaging people could get me out of bed at this particular hour. So genuinely, it's an honor to be here with you all. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about video gaming and games, and I'm coming at it from a particular perspective. As you can see, I am of course coming live from the set of Super Mario World, and I am not just wearing a hoodie, but I am wearing a hoodie of an esports team that an amateur esports team that I am a part of, and all of this is deliberate because effectively I am what I suppose one could call a gaming skeptic, and by that I mean I've been asking myself for a while, both in my role at Moonshot and my role at RAN, as to whether or not there's something special about gaming that lends itself to radicalization, as opposed to there are a handful of, I suppose, distinct phenomenon which are confused for something strategic going on. And I'll take you through some of the categories of I suppose, ways in which we've seen gaming culture, gamification being used, and then hopefully that can make for some fodder for a better discussion. So in my role at RAN, the Radicalization Awareness Network, we spent a little bit of time thinking about this exact phenomenon, thinking about gaming, gamification, its intersection with extremism, as it was something that was very high on the agenda of an awful lot of individuals inside government and out. And while doing that, we actually broke this down and distilled it into 6 distinct areas. The first 3 of which are specifically related to games, and then the second 3 of which less so. To start with the most kind of well-known and high-profile example, the first phenomenon is the production of bespoke video games. There are a number of high-profile examples that often get used extremists making their own video games. Ever since I was at the master's program that Shiraz leads, I and many other people were hearing about the fact that one time Hezbollah in the early 2000s created a video game. And I was somewhat surprised when it was re-engaging with the literature to see that that example is still kind of front and center in a lot of people's minds as proof positive that computer games are a key plank of extremist radicalization strategies. Of course, there are more up-to-date examples. There are games like Heimat Defender, Ethnic Cleansing, and other high-profile right-wing games as well. But ultimately, the production of bespoke games is not something which has, we've seen anyway, had a strategic impact on recruitment across the board. Rather, they've been PR coups, usually when folks play into extremist hands. Speaking of PR coups, the second category I want to look at is modification of extremist video games. An awful lot of games will allow extremists and non-extremists alike to create modded versions of those games. So there have been, examples recently of Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty modded by Daesh supporters and others. But the reason we make the distinction between production of bespoke games and modding games is that modding a game is actually considerably easier again than creation of a new game entirely, and doesn't demonstrate a deep technical impact. Yet when it takes deep technical knowledge, yet when it takes place, very often journalists and others will kind of clutch their pearls and talk about how, oh my God, ISIS has its own computer game. This must be how the kids are getting radicalized to ISIS, as opposed to it being a kind of an attention-grabbing piece of PR, which we're, by giving it too much attention, potentially looking at too closely. The final piece within games is in-game chat, and this is one that I think maybe has a little bit more to it. As of course many of you know, an awful lot of computer games allow players to participate in conversations with one another, to chat with each other, and this chat function, as with any chat function, could be used to facilitate grooming. And there are some examples of extremists using this chat function to facilitate kind of initial conversations with individuals. Separately to the games themselves, there are a range of other cultural touchstones, and there are a range of other kind of gaming adjacent elements that are relevant here. The first of which is gaming adjacent communications platforms. So when I think about this, the most prominent example that comes out is Discord, which is a social media platform which originally grew up to support the gaming community, but which now has a much wider reach. Twitch is another very good example of this. But it is important to note that although these platforms originally emerged to serve the gaming community, they've now grown well beyond that and are used for a wide variety of purposes, some nefarious, including use by violent extremists. Another element of this is gaming cultural references. So this would be the fifth element. Extremists use popular cultural references all the time, and they always have done, and likely always will. So again, we've all seen the famous images of Daesh supporters, appropriating images from Call of Duty, saying, Call of Jihad, and repurposing the video game covers. And of course, the Christchurch killer ironically asked his followers to subscribe to PewDiePie before carrying out his horrific massacre. And then the final element that is often that is certainly present is gamification. So gamification is a powerful tool which can be used across the board for all sorts of activities, and violent extremism is no exception. There's been some fascinating work done in gamification by wonderful scholars such as Linda Schlegel, and we've seen kind of attempts to gamify radicalization, extremism, and terrorism attacks on forums talking about killers achieving a high, inverted commas, high score. So each of these phenomenon, obviously, it is taking place. I've provided examples of each of them. However, I would argue that they are in fact distinct phenomena, and that we run a risk if we put all of that into one box and decide because of these things that gaming in and of itself is a risk factor, or that gamers are potentially at risk group. Gamers account for over 50% of the population in North America and in Europe. So people that do some amount of online gaming account for well over 50% of the population. As such, gaming cultural references are now just part of the general discourse. So the use of a gaming cultural reference by a violent extremist is not proof that gamers, as the kind of 1990s vision of them, of a kind of a young man in his mother's basement, are as a group at risk. Quite the opposite. It's proof that this has become so mainstream that it would be highly unusual if you did not find a violent extremist who had some history of gaming. I would argue that a lot of the attempts to problematize gaming in and of itself actually hold their roots in the mid-1990s, where in the aftermath of the horrific Columbine killings, there was attempts to point to the gaming habits of the individuals involved, as opposed to pointing at gun control and other underlying issues as to kind of what went wrong in those instances. So ultimately, I suppose the argument I would make is there are many examples of kind of use of games, gamification, gaming cultural references across the board, but it would be a mistake for us as practitioners to mistake the kind of prevalence of gaming in popular culture, which feeds through naturally to violent extremism, with the idea that gaming in and of itself is something that is problematic. Instead, we should be focusing on gaming's potential positive roles, and we should think, and I'd love to discuss with the panel, about the potential use of esports to bring people out of violent extremism, prevent violent extremism. And also, none of this is to say that gaming as a kind of a culture is without its flaws. Gaming, of course, has many, many issues, but as do many other pastimes, sports, and hobbies. So I think that's basically my time up.
Thank you so much, Ross, for that excellent presentation. Our next panelist is Dr. Camilla Leon, and she's a researcher at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, who specializes in the study of terrorism and political violence, and has experience working on secessionist conflicts, religious extremism, and radical right social movements. Take it away.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm going to use few slides just to. Can you see the slides?
No, they're not showing up on my screen.
No.
There they are. There's your screen. We see your screen.
No, I can't get it. I don't know. Anyway, I will just talk through. I'm Camilla Leon. In this presentation, I focus on what can be called a digital ideological evolution, a phenomenon which underlies the rise of memes, slurs, and gamification. Extremist pop culture is not based on a single ideology. If we ask what is the ideology of the extremist pop culture, it does not come from a single source. then how do we understand the popular culture of extremism? We know memes, the tantalizing visual mediums with simple, clear messages. Memes are like thought bombs that hook people into alternative realities. Memes entertain people with their simple creativity. Just think about the lolcat memes, which generated lots of enthusiasm. It's fun, it's lighthearted. Memes are also kind of stress busters. Memes behave the same way when those are used to propagate extremism. Then there are slurs, entertaining but insulting communication. Gamification is the cutting-edge development in extremist pop culture. What happens here, extremists invade the popular culture and make it work for them. That is the simple explanation. But what is the big picture? What is the big picture of, behind this phenomenon? Extremist pop culture hides a deeper phenomenon. This deeper phenomenon is the most potent weapon in the extremist arsenal. It is metapolitics. What is metapolitics? Metapolitics brings the battle into the foundations of culture. The European New Right and its predecessor, Nouvelle Droite, in 1960s, led by people such as Guillaume Faye and Alain de Benoist, advocated a metapolitical project. They applied Gramscian ideas of metapolitics. Antonio Gramsci saw the need for a counter-hegemonic battle to reclaim the cultural space. The European New Right believed that without a long-term cultural conquest against hegemonic neoliberalism, it is not possible to destroy the current system. What we see manifesting as the extremist pop culture is a metapolitical assault against the cultural foundations of neoliberalism and liberal democracy. When a battle is raged at a cultural level, it manifests differently from other battles we used to know, such as political, economic, military, or ideological battles. This is a different topography. A cultural battle against liberal democracy produces a confusing blend of indicators to show what is going on. One salient indicator I want to underline is the digital ideological evolution, which supports extremism. How do we understand this digital ideological evolution that takes shape online? If we look into the Great Awakening map, which is the wider agenda of QAnon, we see many ideologies. We can take it as an example. We see many ideologies, beliefs, creeds, many different interest groups are coming together to defy democracies. The Great Awakening map, which is the wider agenda of QAnon, it shows how different ideologies and beliefs are mixed with a total disregard to reason. I have categorized many inclinations GAM uses to create its theory. We can see extremist pop culture is kind of using everything. They use everything. Conspiracies, religious beliefs, political ideologies, and alternative realities. Many subcultures such as UFO cults, conspiracy circles, eco-warriors, spiritualists, alternative lifestyle people, all are coming together to create a political cause against the current system. This is the unification of ideas and beliefs beyond reason. It's bad news for democracies. It unites various segments of societies and give them reasons to defy democracies. To summarize, we must understand what is behind the extremist pop culture. It's a metapolitical assault on the cultural foundations of the current system. Then we must understand how this cultural assault manifests, uniting many subcultures, ideologies, beliefs, and fringe movements. What we see as the madness of QAnon is a subculture. When we see the democratic system, QAnon followers see it as the deep state. Extremist pop culture is the visible manifestation of a metapolitical cultural assault. And we witness subcultures unite, resulting in a digital ideological evolution. Actually, I wanted to use few slides, but I'm sorry I couldn't get it to the screen. Anyway, that's I want to summarize. Behind extremist pop culture, there are some mechanisms. It's a cultural battle, and it unites subcultures. And then we can see numerous segments of the societies, fringe movements are coming together and developing a kind of blended ideology. A digital ideological evolution is taking place online. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liyanage. I'm going to stop the share right now so I can, there we go, back to the screen. Our next participant is, or panelist rather, is Amy Lee, who leads Storyful's global intelligence team. And they focus on analyzing the dynamics of the social media ecosystem across multiple platforms. We're looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So let me know if that.
Yes, we can see that.
Great, thanks. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the, maybe the, I guess you refer to it as the top of the funnel when it comes to extremist culture. So looking at the range of edgy to extremist and understanding a little bit about the humor that dominates and helps drive some of these conversations. First I kind of want to talk about the fact that obviously with the events, the Capitol, we have started to understand the way that online behavior translates into offline action. I think there have been moments where that kind of action ranges from silly to lauded. In some cases, it's people eating Tide Pods. In other cases, it's hordes of K-pop fans banding together to drown out White Lives Matter hashtags. But ultimately, I think what we see is that even within fringe communities, extremists actually operate like fandoms, and that the media that tends to be the most persuasive actually has some level of a positive social component attached to it. In a lot of ways, these movements are actually decentralized by design. You've seen this in some of the early movements with flash mobs, Anonymous, and others, and there is a level of, let's say, choose your own adventure to that. So if you're not, for example, down with the white supremacist side of the Boogaloo movement, but you still have an interest in overthrowing the government, you might go into another corner where they are pro BLM. In a lot of ways, the gateway activities offline actually mirror some of the gateway activities that you see online. And I have there a kind of screenshot of a conversation that was on patriot.win, where there is a deep level of detail about how to coax people both on and offline from being just all talk to acting on those beliefs. And in this case, they're saying, rather than just talking about it, go out there and find ways to start to ease people into actually acting, whether that's just printing out stickers to put over BLM posters or it's something else. And I think more than anything, what we see across a lot of this is that people are at first part of these communities because it does give them a sense of belonging. And it's that level of community pressure that actually motivates them to act. The last point here is about the loud vegan, which is, I would say there are not necessarily a lot of vegans who are percent of the US, but online, they make up a pretty dominant part of the culture and conversation around health. And I think the same tends to be true when you look at gaming communities and adjacent communities who are often generating a lot of the culture that you see. In a lot of ways, humor is a way of hiding. And the post that you see on the right here, which takes a cue from the Always Has Been meme, actually points out very specifically, this is an authoritarian right group that's disguised as a Star Wars fan page. And satire tends to be a really simple way to say that the things that you're saying that might seem like they're offensive are actually just part of the humor, right? So if you don't understand why it's funny, then you're not part of the group. And within some of these gaming communities and in general around this culture, there's a level of nihilism and a level of kind of let's call it crude talk that makes up the tone and the vernacular that people are able to signal to each other with. And there's a lot of intersection there between, even something like Boogaloo Boy memes and, terminology, where there are plenty of mainstream internet users who are using some of those formats like, title blank, like Electric Boogaloo or, blank Boogaloo edition. And so in some ways, what you see is that satire, which used to be a means of avoiding censorship from repressive regimes, is still being used in those ways. But there are a lot of times where it becomes something that's a little bit borderline. And you'll see there kind of a reference to Poe's law, where it is almost impossible in some cases to tell the difference between something that's meant unironically versus something that is meant for laughs. Part of that translates into the idea that when you are participating in meme making and sharing, you are also participating in those communities. And so you see, dank, edgy, and other tags that are often applied to some of these images, which, in some cases might be offensive, but aren't necessarily offensive to the degree where you might be able to label them as hate speech. But again, that funnel becomes something where you are able to ease people into ways of thinking. And, I think the interesting thing here is that a lot of that is couched in humor. And so one, the barrier to entry has become lower and lower in terms of being able to participate in that creation. But at the same time, when you are creating memes that may be political in nature that are in the name of humor, you are also trying to be more engaging, which helps ramp up some of the toxicity that eventually emerges from that. And I think one example here is on Telegram, there was a sticker set, built around the Pepe the Frog image, which I think had at its height around close to 600,000 downloads. So, I wouldn't want to go without saying that there is massive engagement around some of these areas. And, while not everybody who are in these communities are necessarily espousing extremist views, it is pretty easy to encounter them because of some of the volume and engagement that you're seeing there. In terms of that, let's say, method of trying to pull people in to some of the darker corners, over here we've got something from Stone Toss, who is a pretty popular internet comic artist who has, I think, over 152,000 followers on Twitter. Is highly popular on Tumblr, Instagram, and many of the bigger platforms. And even here, while you might not find the image particularly funny, it's not necessarily something that you might be able to explicitly label as being dangerous. But once people start consuming this, they may eventually end up on his website, where in the comments you actually do have things that are much more explicitly either neo-Nazi or white supremacist, as you can see. And the other thing, of course, is once you do end up in some of those communities, there is no fear of either being banned or moderated against. But you start with something that's a little bit softer, easier to consume before leading into those areas. When we are, I'm sorry, there's a little bit of street noise behind me, but when we are talking about gamification in the sense, I think what we have often encountered as well is that a lot of the people who are engaging and posting some of these more borderline memes are not just, offended by being moderated, but are actually quite savvy to it. So, increasingly we'll see people who are posting on every single thing that they put up, follow my backup, or have, link trees that they are signaling to, or might say, I'm probably going to be banned in the next couple of days, so sign up here. And while that in and of itself isn't necessarily problematic, I think it speaks to some of the one-upsmanship that has entered into the behavior there, and has made it actually something that's interesting to people to get into those things. The other piece of it is that increasingly the cross-posting of media across platforms, so whether it's a TikTok video on YouTube or on Instagram, means that even if something is taken down in one place, people are really ready after that to put it somewhere else. And the last thing I would mention is that in a lot of ways, the idea of censorship has become a rallying cry. So when we go back to that idea of fandoms and the way that fandoms are able to inspire collective action, I have reference to the Streisand effect up here, which is in some ways an effective way to drive engagement and virality by getting yourself banned. So, when someone does end up having some of their content taken down, it becomes something that actually is a form of digital martyrdom, helps them, increase their following on some of those alternative sites, or to use these mainstream sites and the takedowns as proof of their having been correct, or proof of a bias against their belief systems. And, basically ends up becoming something where, rather than it being a case of, let's say, just using a single platform to promote their beliefs or to reach out to people, there is a sense of playing whack-a-mole with the platforms or with the moderators, so that actually it helps extend the reach. And I think that's me at time, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was a really interesting presentation. So we're getting ready to move into the discussion portion. I would like to ask the presenters to go ahead and, if you're comfortable doing it, turn your cameras back on, because these will have questions for individual, but questions for the group as well. So let's start. We have a few questions. Feel free to keep entering questions and I will pose them as they come in. Our first question, I think, was a little related, or is kind of a general question. So it's based around on how students can gain information and a broad understanding of kind of different extremism and radicalization theories and their interaction with technology to ensure a kind of solid theoretical base, or gain experience in the area of extremism and counterterrorism studies. And I'm not sure if that was initially meant for a response to Shiraz's talk, but any thoughts you might have on what might be good resources for students starting out in looking up looking into extremism, radicalization, and technology. And that's directed to the panel.
I think there are lots of related articles and insight pieces produced by the GNET. I think that would be the kind of entrance to especially examine these specific interconnections, because these interconnections, I think, in the wider scholarly articles and scholarly the knowledge, these three interconnections are kind of really missed. So this is, I think GNET is the first point to enter the wider knowledge. And then I think there are lots of articles recently in journalists produced really good articles related to this new phenomenon. So even Googling these three things will recover lots of information.
Great, thank you so much. I want to kind of maybe work backward at a question that came for the last presentation first. And this is for Amy. Do you think that adding a comment such as, quote, I will likely be taken down shortly, adds to the readership by playing into biases of limited access and time, sort of like marketing, right? So like sort of, we're running out, this is the last one, you've got to get in on it now, kind of marketing strategy.
Yeah, and I definitely think there is an element of that. And actually, it's funny that you refer to marketing. And I know we're talking about extremism and not necessarily some of the other ideological movements that we've seen. But within some of the anti-vaccine movements, you actually see explicitly that people who are big in that area are offering out resources that are pretty much word for word what I would call digital marketing. You know, how do you grow a following? How do you, you know, grow your reach? How do you, you know, up your page ranking and things like that? So I think there is an aspect of get it now before it's gone. But I think the other and kind of more powerful aspect of it is really, you know, how would I put it? Like increasing your star power. I'm so dangerous that I've been banned because they don't want, this is the stuff the government doesn't want you to see. And I'm being banned because I'm being banned, it obviously must be true. So there's a definite element of that. And I think also once people start piling onto it, there's a momentum that happens where everyone's kind of getting into it and sort of in the rush of, well, I'll put up another mirror of this and I'll put up another mirror of it there. And it goes from there.
Thank you. So we have several questions for Ross. It's really got a lot of kind of juices going. So the first one frames the question kind of around the idea that gaming and gamification are under-researched areas in CT, which is maybe why they reflect the more antiquated position as well, and a little bit of skepticism around maybe gaming not being considered a vector in radicalization, at least until there's more research. But the question is, could Ross expand on how gaming can play a role in prevention as well as blind spots that should be further researched? There's a couple where kind of that prevention point really got people interested. So could you talk a little bit more about how it might be used in prevention? Yeah,
I can try and touch on a couple of the things there. I'll start with some of the initial skepticism. I mean, my background, as discussed initially, is not as an academic. I spend most of my time with kind of either dealing directly with frontline practitioners or talking to policymakers. So I suppose the reason that I take a kind of what I think is attempts to be a bold position saying maybe this isn't a risk factor, everybody relax, is because I'm so used to it being taken as a given. So then, you know, both I've kind of had to kill policy papers which referred to gamers as being distinctly at risk of violent extremism with no evidence to back it up, on more than one occasion. Similarly, I've spent quite a lot of time with frontline practitioners where the solution is, well, if we can just get the kids to log off the internet, then we'll stop radicalization, as if there wasn't terrorism in the 1970s and the 1980s. So I think that's part of the reason that I take a particular position on that. And that's also the challenge, I suppose, and I agree with the question, that I think more research does need to be done, but I think the research needs to be done without presupposing the outcome. So I think far too often we go into this saying, how can we find a handful of anecdotes to prove that there's a link between gaming and extremism, as opposed to objectively looking at gaming as one hobby that many people participate in, and then comparing, for example, the number of lone wolf attackers that play basketball to those that play video games. Far too often I've seen kind of studies that are a little weak and cherry picky, but I would love if there was more research done onto this, so that we can actually start to bottom out some of the connections, if any, and some of the causal links, if any. So yeah, the challenge for both practitioners and researchers, I think, is to just turn that on its head. Instead of presupposing that gaming is a risk factor, challenge yourself to try and prove it without relying on everyone's biases, because I do feel like we have a lot of those underlying biases. In terms of prevention, the preventive point, I think that esports and gaming can be used for prevention in the same way that sports is used for prevention. It is totally uncontroversial in counter-extremism to say that you're going to have a sports and counter-extremism or sports and PvE program. No one would bat an eyelid. That would be funded almost immediately. Yet when you talk about esports, there's a huge amount of evidence to show that it's a great way of building camaraderie, building community, getting people interested. People get a bit strange about it. And again, I would argue that the reason for that is that the whole idea of esports and gaming as being part of the problem, as opposed to being neutral in the same way that football is neutral. But if there's a Nazi football team, that's a bad thing. It doesn't mean that all football is inherently Nazi, because some Nazis used it. I think we would also want to use the same framing for esports and gaming, and think about it as a way that you can bring people together. You can have shared interests. You can build communities interculturally and otherwise. And I worry that the negative view of gaming, which exists among policymakers and frontline practitioners, stifles potential innovative attempts to use esports to counter extremism in the same way we'd use any other kind of sport or hobby to counter extremism.
Great. And then I'd like to follow that one up with a question on follow up on the chat function used for extremists for grooming. Someone has asked if there's a specific age or demographic that's being targeted for that type of grooming.
The examples I've heard are all anecdotal, so I wouldn't want to give this is one of the weaknesses, is I do have some examples, and I've spoken to some frontline practitioners, some of whom are speaking about individuals that are quite young, some of whom are speaking about individuals that are in their late teens, and across a wide variety of platforms. So I don't have evidence beyond the anecdotal that there is a particular age or demographic, although there are, of course, plenty of anecdotal examples of lots of different gaming platforms and lots of different age groups within that. But I fear that in this instance, the anecdote doesn't kind of stack up to evidence overall, as opposed to being kind of isolated incidents. Again, if there's research out there that contradicts that, I'd be fascinated to hear.
Great, thank you. So we're going to bounce for a minute over to memes before we come back to gaming, just to kind of take a break in the two kind of ideas for a second. So we have a general question, which I would submit to anyone on the panel regarding this. Is anyone aware of training programs, government, private sector, or otherwise, about how to use memes, et cetera, for counterterrorism, counter-narrative strategies and tactics? Are there any programs out there at the moment that anyone is aware of that take that up, maybe? It's not looking good.
Yeah, I think the manga subculture must be learned. I thought about it, but I am not aware of any programs. Manga subculture and those drawing methods must be learned and then used for the counter radicalization initiatives. But I'm not aware of any organization that doing that, the specific thing.
Great, thank you. This one is for Amy. So the question is, meme culture is pretty much amorphous on the web these days. When it comes to the roles of platforms or organizations like GIFCT, Tech Against Terrorism, what are the ways to distinguish between memes, extremist memes, when the base image is not limited to extremist circles? So context ecosystems play an important role. So how do you infer context while respecting human rights, avoiding creating the sense of scapegoating, which reinforces the in and out group dynamics?
Yeah, no, I actually think this is something that we have had a lot of conversations about internally, because it is really difficult, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's the question of just because you share something that might express certain things, can you condemn someone for being someone who's actually doing something with those things? But to the point of context, I think also increasingly, right, in many cases, a lot of the extremist elements who are taking advantage of memes are taking advantage of memes that are not at their base level extremist. And so to the point of context, I think increasingly, it's not just, is the image present, but what are the kind of different things that you can layer together? And even then, the first action is not necessarily going to be a takedown, but if you have a system in place where certain terms are being flagged, do you have an ability to flag something at a higher level if it's that image against certain terms, against what the other conversations around it might be, right? I think there does need to be a level of sophistication, first in terms of how we're able to detect those things, but secondarily in terms of being able to define what the rationale is for taking something down or not. I don't think there's a simple or easy answer to that, but ultimately I think it's about layering in understanding of either the signals, the situation, and anything else to at least bring something to the point of review.
Great, thank you. Okay. So just a follow up to Amy regarding the Streisand effect. So the question is, you said the Streisand effect may increase popularity on smaller platforms, but is there any data on what would be the impact of borderline content if not removed on major platforms, i.e. takedown may actually avoid more views and therefore risk of radicalization?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Sure, let me try and do it again. So while the Streisand effect may be increased popularity on smaller platforms, right? People can kind of use that as a way to increase their popularity. Is there any data on what the impact of borderline content is when it's not removed from major platforms?
I see. It's hard to say, right? Because I think a lot of the time what we are able to base some of our understanding on is in specific instances. We don't have a full view into, let's say, like kind of the specific user patterns that you might see if you have access to that, even at an anonymous level, in terms of who has seen what after they have seen something. Can you actually analyze things that they might be engaging with or posting or sharing? And I know even at an individual platform level, there's going to be some difficulty in tracking, for example, if they are going off that platform, as so many of them are, when they are becoming more radicalized, at that point you stop having a view of them and what that might mean or might not mean. So there's a lot of inferences that you have to make that don't necessarily, give you a full view of what might be happening there. But I would say it's probably something that is worth studying and probably would require a level of collaboration potentially to see what that is, because at the moment, all you can tell is things that are a little more blunt force in terms of has a single person or single people that you are looking at, has their behavior changed, and can you link that to either people they've started following who have certain kinds of content that they're posting, so on and so forth. But it's, again, I think just not something that is as simple to put together, as easy to see some of those patterns as we might like it to be, to try and draw some of those conclusions.
Okay, and then I'm going to do a couple of kind of broad to the group questions, and then we've got a couple more for Ross specifically. So the first kind of broad to the group question is, despite the evidence that takedowns can be reframed as badges of honor to enhance extremist profiles, status, and recruitment, governments remain beholden to the idea that takedowns equal progress. What's required to shift policy in this area? And if we refocus away from takedowns, does that leave the space wide open for social influence?
I'm happy to give this one a shot.
Take it away, Ross.
I mean, I'm always reminded when we'd have this kind of takedown conversation of drama classes I took in university, especially improv, when you'd always when someone said something, you'd say, yes, and. And this is what I think about when we think about takedowns, is there's occasionally this binary which exists between intervention programs, counter messaging programs, off-ramping programs, or takedowns. And I think the answer for all of us should be both. I think takedowns are an essential part in keeping ecosystems clean. And if we think about 2014, 2015, where you could kind of wrap up an ISIS network on Twitter, a very active one, really, really quickly with some basic snowball sampling, you just can't do that anymore. And that can only be a good thing. But we need more than takedowns as well. So I do worry that about takedowns being the only metric. But I also I don't think it's particularly useful if we set them up as if they're somehow in opposition to each other. And we need takedowns and other proactive and protective measures.
And
yeah, I think I would agree with that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just in terms of the other aspect of takedowns, other than, let's say, if they are a badge of honor or something like that, is that can often result in a whack-a-mole effect if that's the only thing that you are doing, or if that's where the major focus is, especially as people get more savvy about responding to takedowns as a primary tactic to counter them. I think it is less effective than maybe it used to be, especially because people know, well, if I get taken down here, I can pop back up here. I'll just change my username a little bit, or I'll pop back up here. I'll just wait 3 months. So, it's kind of like, how do you layer that in with other things or other forms of understanding so that it's not so easy or so simple to do that?
Definitely. So are we ready to move on to the next kind of broad question? This question is for anyone on the panel who wants to address it. The question is, recent research has established a link between misogyny, violence against women, and violent extremism. Do we think this relationship has anything to do with gaming being a potential platform for recruitment? As a gamer myself, I don't think it's the case that most games are intrinsically sexist, but I have certainly experienced misogyny in online games. So I wonder whether this plays into violent extremist ideology. And that is open to anyone on the panel who would like to take it up. Right.
I mean, given the misogyny question, I'm reluctant as a man to be the first one to jump in. I'll touch on it briefly because it mentioned gaming, just so that the responder is getting an answer. Yes, I think that's true. I think that there is an intersection between misogyny and violent extremism. In my opinion, for example, I would consider the incel movement to be a distinctive terrorist phenomenon, or at least be capable of being one, the violent incel movement, that is. And there are obviously connections between kind of the misogynistic undertones that exist in certain gaming communities, and that that's potentially an unexplored area, one which would be interesting to see more of. And none of what I'm saying previously is to deny that there are deep problems with misogyny and many different gaming communities. So yes, and I think it should be explored more.
If no one on the panel is averse, my specialty is gender and right-wing extremism, including the manosphere. I'll also follow up to say that the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism looks at this topic very explicitly. And we have many gamers who are also fellows there, so they write about this. It's a good source for that type of exploration. I would also say Gamergate, although it is not explicitly extremist, is an event where many of the tactics that are later developed and used in the alt-right and right-wing extremism online start. So there are definite links and circulations between the two, and a lot of exploration and really good work has been done in the last few years on that. All right, sorry, that was my question that ran into my area. Pardon me for that. All right, so going back, Ross, you just very popular. So quickly, from your research, do you observe that gamification appears to be more widely prevalent in radicalization efforts amongst right-wing extremists as opposed to Islamist extremist groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
So the research I'm quoting on gamification is entirely the research of an incredible female academic called Linda Schlegel, who I would highly recommend people read her work. I am trying to remember and regurgitate her work. So my recollection of her work is that it's focused a little bit more on the violent far right, but also looked at Salafi jihadism. But for anyone and everyone in the audience, this is not my research. It is a research of Linda Schlegel. Please do go and check her out and read her work directly.
Definitely, and I would also say there are several folks that have done work on Islamic Islamic jihadist use of gaming, right? So you might want to look in her citations, because I'm sure they're in her paper citations if you want more on that side of the house as well. For Ross again, I was wondering if any of your research focused on how gaming could potentially lead to the desensitization of violence, not only towards violent extremism, but also in the private sphere, for example, domestic and gender-based violence.
So again, I'd love to hear what the other panelists think, or potentially even audience members think. The research that I have found has been incredibly inconclusive on this. So on a societal level, it seems obvious to say the levels of gaming that exist in South Korea and Japan are incredibly high, and the levels of general violence in those societies are incredibly low. Similarly, interpersonal violence, there are some examples of kind of more intense emotions taking place during that, during kind of participation in video games, but the extent to which that connects with actual participation in offline violence, I haven't seen the research, and I'm personally not convinced, but I am not an academic. So if any of my fellow panelists or anyone else says they have seen the research, I would desperately plead with everyone here to pay attention to people with doctorate ahead of their name instead of me. So for me, I haven't seen it. One thing that I have seen is that those heightened, there's been a lot of really interesting research done about the heightened emotional intensity that takes place during high-risk games and games that give the brain a feeling of peril, a lot of which tend to be linked with violence. And that at those moments, social connections that are made can be considerably stronger. So this could be an avenue, this could be a reason that violent extremists may wish to target violent video game players while they're playing games. But it's also a potential reason where, although it's counterintuitive, violent video games may work incredibly well as CVE and PVE tools, because while people are in that heightened emotional state and are able to make stronger connections, they could potentially be making stronger connections with positive influences in their life rather than negative influences in their life. So there's some fascinating work that's been done on this, and it's by no means conclusive, and certainly the way that the research is sometimes framed, I think is less than helpful.
Definitely. All right, so we have, if no one else has an answer for that, we have one kind of the $64,000 question left, and that should lead us right to the end of our time.
I think the violent video games creates the environment, but it does not lead to violence naturally. There must be some kind of backdoor, and some extremist actors must work to divert this environment and its feelings to some kind of real world cause. So violent video games wouldn't be, it's not doing it automatically. Violent video games are there, but radicalization is not happening automatically. There must be some actors to use these emotions and this environment to divert this environment and the feelings to some kind of political cause or some kind of ideological cause. And so I think that's the answer. But I have seen some psychological research based on psychology, how psychology works in violent video game environments. So the psychology, the feelings and the intensity can be easily diverted to some kind of real world cause. That's all.
Great, thank you. So this last question is going to take us to the end of our time, but it's open to anyone on the panel who's willing to take a stab at it. Do you think we will see a bigger wave of young violent extremists coming from gaming, memes, internet, pop culture, right from the topic of our panel? And if so, will it be more extreme than current waves of extremism? Like I said, $64,000 question.
I don't know if I could answer more extreme necessarily. And, in a lot of ways, right, it's not like pop culture hasn't always had strong elements of violence. Go back 50, 100, 500 years, I would guess that you're going to find people who are very happy, to go to the Coliseum and watch gladiators rip each other apart. I think it's less maybe about the format and the content of some of what we're talking about in terms of the level of violence, and more about the speed at which people are able to communicate, the kind of removal of barriers and boundaries. One thing I don't think I've really touched on, but especially when you're talking about visual imagery, it really makes it a lot simpler to cross national and language borders. And, it's something where as things like chat kind of become ascendant again, you're also involved in information that moves a lot more quickly and content that moves a lot more quickly. And, people who are able to learn from each other and band together in ways that I think weren't possible. But I think that's maybe more of what drives some of what we might be seeing now that feels different than necessarily like the actual level of violence in the content.
Great, thank you so much. So we are at the end of our time for the panel today. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the planners and organizers at GNET. And thank you to our attendees for being with us all across the globe and being so interested in asking excellent questions. Really have a lovely rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you.